Welcome back to Nutrition Connection, the show where science meets storytelling. I'm your host, Dr. Kristen Hicks-Roof, dietitian, researcher, and lifelong advocate of the role of nutrition, health, and wellness. Each episode, I sit down with dietitians and nutrition experts all across the food and healthcare landscape, leaders whose work touches nearly every aspect of our lives. So whether you're a student, a seasoned professional, or someone simply curious about the role of food, nutrition, and health, this podcast is just for you. The views, thoughts, and comments on this podcast do not reflect those of my employer nor the employers of my guests. So let's go ahead and get connected. Today, I'm really excited to bring on a new connection of mine, Bec McDorman. She's the regional registered dietitian at M&S in Anchorage, Alaska. Welcome to the show, Bec.
Thank you for having me.
So Bec has a weekly Substack. It's Bec's Weekly CU Roundup, and that's actually how I know her. She posts awesome memes and a lot of really cool information, as well as free continuing education. And then we kind of connected after that, and so I was excited to have you on the show, and I can't wait to talk about your journey and how you became a dietitian and now what you do at M&S. So Bec, what really inspired you and made you want to become a nutrition professional in the first place?
So I was actually inspired by my own personal experience with a dietitian. I had weight loss surgery back in 2010 and um, was working with my dietitian. And unfortunately, I don't feel like she was the best fit for working in weight management. I know that there's weight bias can occur on both sides. So larger people can be biased against thinner people, just as much as thinner can be biased against heavier people. And so I was definitely experiencing some bias against my dietitian, but I just didn't have the best experience. And I didn't feel like I was really being heard. And so because of that, it kind of inspired me of, well, I could become, the expert in bariatric nutrition. And so that was what really fueled me through quitting my job in marketing, going back to school to get my master's while simultaneously doing the DPD, through getting into my internship and finishing up my master's research in Southern California while simultaneously doing my internship in Baltimore at Johns Hopkins. All of that was fueled by I'm going to be in bariatric nutrition. And when I got into my internship and I did my outpatient nutrition rotation and I did the bariatric program, I fell out of love pretty quickly. And it was a big shock to me, but I ended up falling in love with clinical and loved it and got a job as a lead dietitian straight out of my internship at a small community hospital in Central Washington. So I moved back from East Coast back to West Coast, worked there, and then I just continued to kind of be promoted up through the ranks from lead RD to clinical nutrition manager to district clinical nutrition manager to regional nutrition manager. And all of that happened in less than 4.5 years. So I got pretty burnt out pretty quickly, especially with the onset of pandemic. I was supporting my hospital as CNM and then also supporting another hospital with there were two hospitals, a hospital system, two hospitals in a long-term care simultaneously for over 6 months, commuting 2.5 hours back and forth between the two, uprooting, myself, my life, eventually moving. It was a lot. And so after just doing all of that, I was looking for jobs. I didn't want to move because I had moved so much for internship and jobs and all that stuff. So I was like, okay, let's try and stay in Southern California where my family was. And I finally just was like, no, I need a change. And I took off the location filter. And the first job that popped up was regional dietitian in Alaska. And I was like, that's it. I'm moving to Alaska.
That is you've literally covered every part of this country.
Yes. And so it's been a wild ride, but I have not looked back. What I also thought was really funny was that during that whole time, I was so focused on bariatric nutrition and even clinical. I was like, no, I'm not going to be in food service. I don't want to work in food service. And now I love food service. It's what I do. We it's a contracted food service company. We do food service all around the state of Alaska. And I have my toes dipped in clinical for a few of my job responsibilities that I would love to give up in a heartbeat. So I'm just like, I love my food service people. I love what we do. I love our focus on traditional foods. And I've been with the company for 4.5 years now and truly haven't looked back.
That is awesome. And you know what? I think that's one of the most powerful things about becoming a dietitian and nutrition expert. you can pivot in your career, right? And there's so many different career paths, whether you're location bound or maybe you're niche bound. If you kind of take off that filter, literally in your case, if you take off that filter, it allows you to gain this experience and exposure in different areas that maybe you didn't know that you had. And I also loved how you shared kind of your personal story as what brought you into the profession, because so often than not, we're touched by a dietitian, whether directly or indirectly, and how that was maybe a positive or a negative experience. And I think that is an opportunity for us as dietitians of, if that's not your niche and you don't love what you do and you feel like you're not truly helping patients, there's a lot of other roles for you to be in dietetics, to really make
Absolutely.
sure that you're being the best provider that you can be.
Absolutely, and I have gone up and looked up that dietitian, and she pivoted away from bariatrics, and she's thriving in her current role, and I'm so happy for her because it wasn't anything truly against her, she just wasn't the right fit for bariatrics, and I think she found her niche, and she's thriving, so I'm very happy for her.
I mean, I can tell you from personal experience, I used to be a behavioral health lead dietitian at a small behavioral health hospital in College Station. And it was not my expertise, but it was kind of like I was finishing my PhD and it was good kind of part-time work. But I now, looking back, this was so early in my career. And looking back, I'm like, man, was I really the best person? Because I didn't have the skill sets and the knowledge. In one case in particular, I remember I was like educating this patient, and here I am, right? Like on your pedestal, like eat more fruits and vegetables, and here's ways that you could do it. And the patient at one point goes, I don't own a pot or pan. And I'm like, okay, here I am so far off base that like I need to rein it in. And that was such a good realization for me of one, maybe this is not my area that I want to go in. And then two, we need to stop talking textbook nutrition. And it's so individualized and personalized, especially on the clinical side. So I'm curious, like, okay, let's talk about your food service journey since that's where you are now. What do you do in your current role? What does kind of like your day to day look like? And maybe how has that changed as you've been there over the last 4 years as you've maybe, moved up into regional dietitian?
Yeah, so, I've had the same title for the last 4.5 years, but my job has definitely changed for sure. When I first interviewed for the position, there was a panel interview with the outgoing dietitian. She was leaving to go to nursing school, so she was able to stay with the company for a decent amount of time, especially with me moving, getting onboarded, all that. She was able to train me. But I asked her in the interview, "Can you describe a typical day?" And she said, "I can. It changes so much day to day." And I remember being so frustrated with that answer. I was like, come on, there's got to be a tip. No, she was spot on. Every day is different. I do travel to three of my locations are not in Anchorage where I am based. So I do travel to Bethel, Dillingham, and Kotzebue. And so those are my three places that I go. So I'm typically traveling once a month for 5 days. So I'll fly out on a Monday. I'll be there Monday through Friday, and then I leave on Friday. And I do that once a quarter for each of my locations. So it turns into of the three locations, it's once a month that I'm traveling. And my days at the units are often very different depending on, is it February and we're doing beaver roundup in Dillingham where, they used to have traditionally they would bring in the beaver pelts and they would do fur trading and things like that. And now it's turned into a community celebration where there's a parade and we have our barbecue trailer out there and we're standing out in -7-degree temperatures and we're selling food. Or now we have our food trucks so we can be inside where it's still pretty cold, but we're, selling food, giving out, over 500 burgers to the community. That's a day sometimes, and sometimes it's me working from home on my computer in Excel, looking at menu spreadsheets. We just got a new contract for an assisted living facility that also has a daycare, and they previously had a Mexican restaurant in their kitchen, using the bottom floor of the building as a restaurant, and so they were serving the residents. That was who was giving them their daily meals. So we've gotten feedback of they don't want any Mexican food because they had so much of it. And so I'm like, okay, well, I was going to do a Taco Tuesday theme. So now I got to pivot on my 5-week cycle menu, change out the Taco Tuesday theme, replace it with something else, while also then incorporating traditional foods that we like to do for our Alaska Native population. Um, we rely sometimes on donations. So we'll get a donation in of, caribou. And so then we can go and do all these different fun things. We have a processing plant locally that will process it into caribou bacon, caribou roast, all these different things. And so, we're pivoting and saying, well, what recipe can we do to use up this meat or that meat? And it's really cool to truly not have the same any day be the same. Some days it's just, meetings back to back, talking about planning for our different units, and other times it's go, go, go on the ground. It's never the same.
I also love that emphasis of traditional food, and it's really cool that you have the autonomy and the support to be able to fully integrate that in everything of what you do because we know, right? Like you say Taco Tuesday. Well, I'm in Phoenix, and that's like everyone's amped up for Taco Tuesday because we have such a dominant culture, that's Hispanic culture. But that obviously would be different in Alaska, which would be different than, the upper East Coast, right? And so I think that's really
Yes.
special that you get to do that. Now, is that something that you had to really advocate for, or was that something already well established and that was accepted at your, with your company?
So my company is Alaska Native owned. So NMS stands for NANA Management Services. And so the NANA region is a part of Alaska in the northwest area above the Arctic Circle. Those are the NANA shareholders. So people who are born in that region are NANA shareholders. And so that they own our corporation. And so traditional foods has always been a key focus. But in the different facilities, especially in our facilities that I travel to outside of Anchorage, our population is predominantly Alaska Native. And so when they think comfort foods, we might picture, grilled cheese tomato soup. And they're like, no, I don't want that. I want, fish head soup instead. And so it's things like that where we need to contact our producers and say, hey, normally you are, processing these fish and you're tossing the heads. Can we have you send us the heads? Like, please? And so different things like that, or, donated foods where we can receive, moose donations or caribou, things like that. We need to have a process for accepting the meat, making sure it's in, the right condition, making sure we keep it separate from purchased foods. We can never sell donated meat. It can be only for our patients and residents. And so there's just a lot of different things that we have to follow. In addition to in Kotzebue, we have a program called the SIGLOC, and it is run by a full-time hunter-gatherer where he goes out and he is hunting for seal meat. He is hunting for, anything that he can find, caribou, all of that. And so he has that freezer stocked year round for our residents there because they are exclusively Alaska Native residents from that region. And they don't want, the traditional American foods. They want what they grew up eating. And so I've been blessed to be able to try they eat frozen pieces of caribou and you dip it in seal oil, and that's how they enjoy it. And so I've been honored to be able to try that, to be able to try muktuk, which is the whale blubber, which is delicious and amazing. It's truly amazing that we are able to, in a healthcare area, be able to serve these patients and residents the foods that they want to be eating.
Well, and I think I just love this story. And what advice or recommendations would you give, let's say, another clinician who might be listening into this podcast? Like when you go to an area that may be serving foods that are unfamiliar to you, like how did you learn more about those cultural foods? You said you're from, California. So how did you learn about those foods to be able to like integrate them in and feel comfortable and confident nutritionally but also menu development?
Yeah, so what's awesome about the Alaska Native foods is they are actually in the USDA database now. So that's really cool. You can find seal oil in the USDA database. That was a huge project before I started working for NMS that was implemented. I forget the name of the people who worked on that project, but that is awesome to be able to use that for nutrition analysis and things like that. We have that ability, um, but it really is just listening to people and getting feedback. A lot of times people are very hesitant to share because um, of just traumatic history. White people especially, coming in and just taking things over and like, okay, well, this is what you're doing now. And it's like, no, instead, it's like we honor and respect this information and knowledge that you're willing to share with us. Like, you know, hey, where are you going forage? People protect their foraging sites because they don't want other people coming in and trashing it, which is unfortunately what happens when people don't honor the fact that this is, sacred land for some people. And this isn't just, oh, I'm going to go pick blueberries this summer for fun. This is their sustenance. They they do these things to be able to have food in the winter because in a lot of these villages, they don't get to just go to the grocery store when they run out of something. They have to have on hand what they have on hand. So for me, it was a lot of asking questions, listening, finding books that, are not necessarily maybe mass produced, but like, little cookbooks that a community put together is like, oh, here's our community potluck type of recipe thing. And then taking them and working with our chefs and cooks to tweak them and make them to be able to be scaled and then do the nutrition analysis, things like that. So it's asking questions, it's listening, and it's truly coming at it from a place of honor and respect, where this is their culture and their heritage, and you're there to learn and to handle that information with respect, and help them continue to honor their culture.
I love your viewpoint and how the words that you're using. It really is honor and respecting traditional foods. I remember I used to teach a sociocultural class when I was an academic, and one of my assignments was go to a cultural grocery store, find items that you've never cooked with, tried, learn about them, and then cook with them. Because until we understand, which I think is hard, obviously, we're never going to be experts in every single cultural food because we are a melting pot of cultures here in the US, but I think we can continuously do a better job about learning who we're serving, what they like, whether it's a small book, right? A small local cookbook or something like, and then embracing that and integrating it into your practice, whether that's how we talk about it, whether that's what we serve at functions or in the menus. So I just think it's really cool that you do that. So, how does scientific data and evidence fuel what you do in your day to day?
Yeah, I think a lot of that does tie into, the nutrition analysis of things, of using that to make sure we're serving compliant diets. We have at our two acute care facilities, excuse me, we have um, diet software where we have to have our menus programmed in. So we have to look at, okay, how is one hospital preparing the agoutic, which is a traditional food typically made with some type of fat, usually would be an animal fat, a lard with mixed berries and sugar. Other times, they use Crisco as a substitute. I've tried it with fat from smoked hooligan, things like that. So we've had all these different versions of it, and some places, want it a very specific way. So I have to look and say, okay, let's tailor this recipe to how this region wants it prepared, and then that's how the nutrition analysis will go. So one of our facilities is also a behavioral health facility. And so, like your experiences with that, I have to be mindful of a lot of times in the winter, especially, people will come in because they have been displaced and they are roaming around and they come in with frostbite injuries, things like that. And I get a consult saying, oh, BMI of 40. I'm like, that is relevant to their health overall, but I am not going to talk to someone who is unhoused with frostbite injuries about their weight, or someone who came in with an overdose for suicidal ideation. I'm not going to go talk to them about their weight. And so it's, falling back on, you know, the science of nutrition, in the sense of like, understanding weight does have, a play in our health and things like that, but it's not the only factor. And going then off of the science of mental health, of this is not going to be an appropriate conversation for right now, or getting consults for education, where again, like, we use the nutrition care manual from the academy. I have access to all those resources. A lot of those are not at the reading level of the patients, and so usually I will offer them handouts, but they don't usually take them, because if they're unhoused, where are they going to take them when they are discharged also? So it's a lot of that, with playing with the scientific factor of things, but also the human factor, and how that can sometimes outplay the science of it, and just say, no, like, this is not appropriate right now. And so it's definitely can be a challenge with providers who are not familiar with Alaska. They'll come in and like, okay, I'm the new provider here at the hospital, and they start doing things. I'm like, no, that's not how we're gonna do things today. So it's definitely a challenge, but knowing that I'm always falling back on evidence-based interventions, things like that, supporting my teams, with, food safety, making sure we're doing our HACCP logs, things like that. That's part of my role going into the units, is making sure that they're filling out their HACCP logs, they're cold holding foods, or at certain things are using cooling logs appropriately. All of that is falling back onto that food safety aspect and doing education to the staff on food safety, knowing that certain things changed recently with like the ground meat texture or temperature changing up to 158 instead of 155, little things like that are nuances that I need to then go and educate my staff on because there's been changes in the science and it's saying, hey, we don't want to be cooking our ground beef to 155 if the new temperature is 158. We've got to be compliant with that. So a lot of that ties into all of different aspects of my job.
Yeah, that's super interesting. Well, and I love how you talked about like, and I mentioned it too. Sometimes textbook and reality don't necessarily align in how we best deliver. And I think you gave some really good examples because we as clinicians and dietitians, we need to go in and be the best provider for that patient. And so I think sometimes we need to take up the hat off of what do I think is most important versus what does the patient think is most important. And then sometimes it's they just need fuel to be able to stay warm, right? Or to
Yes.
which we have the opposite problem here in Arizona where you're like fueled so that way I'm not any warmer than I already am. So I think that is really important that yes, of course, science is the foundation, but you also need to understand the practical application. I think the behavioral mental health, a lot of my research prior to my role now was really looking at how do you integrate nutrition with mental health, with physical therapists, with physicians, like we can be an all in one group and that's how we can have prioritization as a group and it's not just one thing or another. So you've had a pretty successful career. I mean, you said moving up the ladder, right, in the clinical and then accepting this role as regional RD with NMS. So what is something that you're most favorite or that you're most proud of so far in your career?
Yeah, that's something that's tough that I often actually give people advice on is to document their successes because when I look back at my career, it's hard for me to think about certain things that I'm successful with. And so I do have a portfolio folder where any little project I work on, things like that, I'll put it in there. Um, but I think one of the things I'm most proud of is one of my previous positions. Um, when I was brought on, the dietitian team was fractured. Half the dietitians worked for the hospital because they were there before the contract food service company came on board, and the other half worked for the contract food service company. And so there was some divide between the two halves of the team. It was a small team, but there was one dietitian who was absolutely brilliant, but because of that, she struggled to be understood by not just her team, but by the other managers in the food service department. And so I set up, to me, it was simple coming in, setting up a weekly time slot with her to listen to her, to understand her her confusion with things, her struggles with things, what were her concerns and like, hey, why is this not happening the way it should or things like that. And it was really just her being able to express her frustrations, but then doing something about them and following through for her and realizing that she felt she didn't have the power since she wasn't a manager. So then it was my responsibility. If she has this concern, let me go address it for her. And so all it took for me was listening to her and then doing something about it. But it got to the point where the other managers came to me and they're like, hey, like she doesn't come by and bug us anymore, or like, have all these things. She goes to you now and she trusts that you will get it dealt with. Or in some situations, I'll say, I understand your concern. That's not a big concern of mine. And I don't think it's as big a concern as you think it is. So I think we need to put that on the back burner. And she learned to trust me. She became, was able to do that. And it really helped with the cohesion of the team, the cohesion of the food service department. That was one thing as well, is that the dietitians always felt very separate from the department. So we started including not just myself in the huddle with the food service team, having a dietitian representative there, and it would alternate weekly. And the inclusion that brought to the department was really helpful. And I think that's really what helped bridge my transition from clinical to food service, was realizing that, and I was guilty of it myself in my career. Oh, I don't want to be food service. Oh, that's dietary, things like that. And I still see it now. And I'm like, I'm sorry, dietary is easier to say than this, this is the food service department. So, my food service department, do they call you, "Hey, hello, this is dietary. How can I help?" Sure. And it doesn't bother me anymore like it used to. And I get when those who are working clinical are being asked about, oh, what are we serving in the cafe? And like, well, I don't know. However, like, they're not going to know that you don't know that. So it's something that kind of bridged that gap for me of like realizing that clinical and food service don't have to be so segregated and separate. And I know there's huge importance of both departments. Um, but I think more collaboration between the two is beneficial because I know when I would go see patients and they were struggling to eat or something like that, I could say, "Oh, well, today is Wednesday and we typically have a pasta dish for lunch. Is that something that you want to do?" Like I could speak more to it knowing the menu and things like that. And I know that's different than the retail menu, but it's still, having that dichotomy, that's something that I'm really proud of in myself, but also in my career of kind of bridging that gap between clinical food service and saying like we need to be cohesive because the food service, we feed our patients and that helps them with healing. And so that's definitely something that I'm proud of in my career so far.
I mean, I do think that's something to be really proud of, and you gave such good examples. I mean, I am, like, going way deep in my career when I was a student, actually, a young student, and I used to work in a kitchen, right? I was a prep cook, and the diet office at the time, that's what we called it, that's where the dietitians were housed, they were so separate, and every once in a while, you'd see the dietitian come in, but I think your tidbit of advice is maybe they don't need to be as separate. Like maybe there's opportunity to have more communication and connection to really bring more comprehensive care to the patient. Like you said, if I know what's on the menu or if I see that a patient is not eating as I collect tray, my team is collecting trays, I can let the dietitians know, hey, these people are not doing well in terms of, they're consistently sending their full trays. So I think it can go both ways to be opening
Absolutely.
that channel of communication. And so I really like that advice. So speaking of advice, what other suggestions or advice would you give someone who is interested in a career like yours, especially as you've climbed the ladder both in clinical and food service? Like how how would you recommend or encourage people to do the same if that's something that they're passionate about?
The first thing I would say is to find something that lights your fire. I know that that has pivoted for me throughout my career. When I was a student, I had quit my job in marketing. I already had a business degree. I was, going in, jumping into the deep end, completely. And so I needed to make sure that I was committed because I'd already made the jump. And so I immediately became involved. I became the student liaison for the academy at my university. I became involved with our food and nutrition club. I held different roles there. I became a student volunteer for different DPGs, getting super involved with the weight management DPG early on as a student, and then as an intern, and then as a dietitian. State involvement, district involvement. I was involved from day one, and um, felt that at the time that was what really fueled me and somehow became kind of like an advisor to a lot of other students going through my DPD where, they would come ask me questions about DICUS and like, oh, like, well, what about this for the application? And I was like, This is my first time going through it too, but like, this is what I did." They're like, "Okay, cool." I'm like, "Wait, that's just like, I don't know if that's the correct answer. That's just what I did." But it became, you know, people would come to me for the advice and things like that and in information. And that kind of continued on. I accepted my job as the lead RD, started my position, passed the exam within a month of the position, and then 2 weeks later had my first intern. And I was, that lit my fire of helping, the interns. I had back-to-back interns for almost 2 years that I was in that position, and I loved it. It lit my fire. It pushed me to go on to give them a good experience, knowing that I had a very intense clinical, experience being at Johns Hopkins in Baltimore. We were in a community hospital in Central Washington. I wanted to make sure that anytime we had a complex patient, I would go find research articles, print it out. I would give every intern I had either a binder or a thumb drive with information of like, here's articles of, I had never heard of Ogilvy syndrome. And then I had a patient here who had it. It's a unique thing. Go study it, learn it, because maybe you'll get this when you have a larger facility, more complex patients. But, but that really lit my fire at the time. And so finding that and like having that fuel me and give me energy to do all these different things was awesome. And then it has since pivoted where I do miss having interns. It's tough not being able to have interns because I do travel for my work. So that would be an additional cost that they would have to pay for. And it's just not really feasible. But also I'm not in a unit every day. But I feel like now I've kind of pivoted my passion, my fuel to my Substack newsletter, where that was started back in 2019, just for my small team of 4 or 5 dietitians. I would send out a weekly email because not every dietitian was working daily. So anytime we would have huddles and things like that, I would just type up a few little summaries of what was discussed that week. Oh, okay, here's a funny meme, and then here's the CEU I'm aware of if you want to take it. And then a couple of my dietitian friends found out, like, "Oh, yeah, can you send that to me?" And then I started covering at 2 facilities, so I had started, including all of my dietitians at both facilities, in it, and then working with, Leah with Build Up Dietitians. She started her Substack, and I was doing a Google group at the time, and she was like, "Hey, I really love Substack. It makes it super easy. I think you should switch to Substack." And I'll totally she's like, "I'll totally share your Substack in my own." And so I switched over, and it was so easy to just import my contacts and everything. And the Substack has astronomically increased my. I think I had maybe 200 quote unquote subscribers to my Google group at the time, and I now have well over 1,000 subscribers. There is a paid option which I don't promote. It's just if you want to pay to get past access to past archives, you can. It's $5 a month. I don't do this for the money. I do this because it is my passion and my fuel, kind of a thing, of hearing from other people like yourself who have found it and found use from it. I don't charge companies to share anything on my newsletter. I just want it to be free, if not very, very low cost. So I try to typically stay below the $10 per unit for a CEU to include it in my newsletter. But if it's something I think is really cool or groundbreaking, I will include it if it has a slight cost to it, just because I think people should know about it. But it's definitely it's a passion of love and or a labor of love and something I truly enjoy. And I love when people respond and say, "Oh my gosh, I love this certain meme," or things like that, which I have so many memes saved into a folder now. I'm like, I have to include like 5 or 6 each email because I was just slowly getting bogged down by different ones. But, um, you know, allowing yourself to pivot. I pivoted from bariatrics to clinical to food service, finding your different passions, it can help you avoid that burnout, but knowing that burnout is also a thing, but just, giving yourself that grace of checking in and saying, is this still what fuels my fire? Is this still what gives me that passion? Loving to, go to work each day, or, is it time for a change? And I think that's something that with dietetics, there is so much that can be done in different ways that, don't feel like you have to back yourself into a corner with a certain thing.
I mean, that was really so this podcast is a labor of love for me too. I love talking about careers and all the different things that dietitians and nutrition experts can do because we are in every sector of agriculture, food, health systems, food service, right? Like we are everywhere. And so it was really like a pet project to inspire people and tell their stories because so often than not, I think people believe that like as a dietitian, like you're pinholed into doing one thing forever. And that's absolutely not the case, especially if you're not happy. I think there's a lot of options. And I love your weekly roundup. Number one, I love a good meme and I try and share it with my kids if I think it's really funny, and they would understand it. But I think it's a good way to be a resource to other people. Right. And so I like that it is a resource for people to find continuing education because we always are looking for continuing education. And what I also love about yours is I'm on some dedicated, lists that are focused on protein, like things related to my job. But what I find is I'm subscribing and enrolling in webinars of topics that I've never heard of or I don't know anything about. And so now I'm enrolling. I'm like, oh, that's really fascinating, and that's my mind being so curious as a thinker of like you're talking about these diets. I'm like, I want to be your patient and go up and try all these delicious foods, traditional foods, because that's something that's really I'm passionate about as well. So if you had a crystal ball What do you think is coming next in nutrition?
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of flux right now, I feel, with different things, and the current political climate with the new dietary guidelines. But I feel like we are really reaching a potential tipping point of dietitians being able to finally break through not just the poor pay that we receive as one of the other healthcare um, workers comparatively. We don't get paid enough. I feel like there's something's got to give soon is kind of what I feel like. That tipping point is coming where if if physicians are now going to start receiving more education on nutrition in schools, who are they going to hire to teach that? I think that'll create more academic options for RDs. I think that there's a lot of growth and opportunities, and in some cases where we are going to be able to take advantage of certain changes in the political climate to help people navigate what's going on currently. And I think that will help grow dietitians and also dietetics. DTRs are also vastly needed. And I think there's different ways to incorporate them kind of as that bridge. Like you said, looking at, kitchen staff to dietitians, having that bridge potentially be a DTR. I actually had NMS create a role for a DTR I worked with in Southern California so that she could work for NMS remotely. And so she's been with the company for almost 3 years now. And so she had worked for me before, and I was like, "Hey, do you want to come work for me?" And she's like, "Absolutely." DTRs are posed to become more utilized in the sense of now having the graduate degree for dietitians versus the undergrad degree for dietetics. I think that there is going to be more opportunity to utilize people at that level to grow and expand nutrition, and I'm really excited to see that because I don't want dietetics to become even more of an exclusive thing. I think that it's very much so been, predominantly female, predominantly white dominated. I would love to see that diversity continue to grow. And I think utilizing dietetics and people who may not be able to afford to go for their master's and the internship right away, utilizing dietetics and having some people realize that you can have an awesome career as a DTR. I think that both of those things are coming where we'll be able to utilize DTRs and dietitians will be posed to truly emphasize their role as the food and nutrition experts.
Yeah, and I think so. I've created with Dr. Karen Beathard and Holly Boo the RD mentorship program almost 10 years ago. And what we saw, and it kind of goes back to what you said at the beginning, when you have these mentoring experiences, it actually helps to increase diversity in our profession. Because when people are mentored by someone who sees them, who understands them, who maybe shares the same cultural or religious relationships, they're able to be more empowered to pursue farther in the career. So I think it's a call to action for everyone listening. Go out and mentor, help to increase diversity in there, and whether that's mentoring future dietitians or DTRs to be able to fill the gaps that hopefully will continue to have more movement and momentum as dietitians will hopefully get better pay, but also more recognition and respect of why we are so critical on healthcare teams, on food service teams, on retail teams in the industry. There's so many reasons why dietitians deserve more respect. And I think hopefully the fact that nutrition is a federal conversation now, what a great opportunity for our profession to be able to step in and say, we are the nutrition experts. We are here to help in every aspect. So, Bec, thank you so much for telling your story. We really appreciate having you on. And if you like the podcast, make sure you follow, subscribe, leave a review. But most importantly, check out the next episode because every episode I bring on a new dietitian and nutrition expert to tell their story. Thanks again, Bec.
Thank you for having me.